nature of the way a husband loves his wife is different than the way a wife loves her husband. And there are certain biblical demands that are made on the husbands, and they're tough. Actually, pretty tough, you know. If Jesus is the image of a husband, he gives himself, totally sacrifices himself for his wife and serves her. And if you are not willing to serve your wife, you should not marry.
There it is.
And if you're not willing to serve the people that you might be a priest for, or a deacon or a bishop for, you know, you're not going to be a good priest. And if you're not willing to really serve your friend, because sometimes friends are great fun to be with, but sometimes they really need you. So if you want to be a giant man, you have to be a servant, like Jesus.
Hello and welcome to another Perusia podcast. I'm Charbel, your host, and very excited with our guest. He is a very tall man who's written a book about giant men. Right here, the tiny book for giant men. The author is a good friend, former AFL grand finalist, Steve Lawrence. Hello, Steve.
Hi, Charbel. How
Did
are
I get
you?
that right? Grand finalist?
Yes, well,
Yes.
actually winning grand finals.
Winning,
so,
yes.
yeah.
It's one thing making it, it's
both
another thing winning.
teams are grand finalists, players are grand finalists, but only the winning team is the Premiership. So,
Yeah, wow.
I mean, I'm very fortunate about that.
Yeah, praise God. Now, you're many other things. I mean, husband, father, evangelist. You're a speaker now, full time. You've been doing quite a bit with the church. How's everything going? It's been busy.
Yeah, great. Annie and I just had our 32nd wedding anniversary. No,
Wow.
31st wedding anniversary.
Wow, praise God.
We've got 6 kids, 2 granddaughters.
Congratulations.
Have my own business. lots of graces. But yeah, I mean, like everyone, just a poor, wounded sinner. But by the grace of God, lots of things are happening. So one of which, of course, is this book, which is it's for giant men, but that's not just for tall men.
No.
We'll talk about that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, I first met you in Sydney.
Uh-huh.
I don't know if you remember this.
I do.
I was a seminarian,
Uh-huh.
and you lived on the seminary.
We lived in
sort
the
of
seminary,
grounds.
yeah.
With your family, your
Correct.
wife, and how many children at the time?
So we had lived in 3 years in Rome prior to
Okay.
coming to Sydney, because we're
Yes.
from Melbourne. So we went for 2 years to Rome, and it ended
Yes.
up being 3 for the Emmanuel School of Mission. And
Were
then
you married then? So you were married.
Yeah, married. We went with 4 little kids under the age
Wow.
of 6, and we conceived Jerome in Sydney. In Rome, and then we came back to Australia, but came to Sydney. So we had our 5th and 6th in Sydney.
Okay.
And we were living in the seminary. The kids say that they grew up living in a cemetery.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's where we would have met.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Because you were very instrumental. University chaplaincy, World Youth Day was a big part of your role. Yeah, you have quite a bit of a career within the church. For how many years now have you?
Pretty
Direct.
much. Well, I was, for 12 years of footy with Hawthorn
Yes.
in the AFL from when I finished school. But that overlapped with the last 2 years of that. I was in charge of youth ministry for the Melbourne Archdiocese
Okay.
when Cardinal was Archbishop in Melbourne.
Oh, yes.
And then we went to Rome. And so basically from that time, my background is essentially in ministry and education,
Okay.
usually in Catholic contexts. So, yeah, that's been my call, and it continues to be.
Yeah. Wow. Were you always practicing Catholic growing up?
This is part of my
Yeah.
story now.
Yeah, that's
So,
okay.
look, I'm one of 4 boys, born in South Africa.
Oh, wow.
My family
Forgot about
came to Australia when I was 5. We were a Catholic family. Didn't really, we went to Mass on Sundays, we prayed grace, but essentially faith wasn't really a big part of our life until my dad went on a pilgrimage to Fatima when I was about 11. And he came back and started to implement the messages of Our Lady of Fatima in our home. So the Rosary was introduced, Lives of Saints and things like that. And this was the beginning of my conversion, my real conversion.
Yes.
The same time, Mum and Dad were going through enormous conflict, which emerged around that period. So, and some of that was quite a fair bit of hostility in relation to the faith from my mum. So that was,
Okay.
she had a nervous breakdown, the difficulties like that.
Oh, wow.
But really there was enormous conflict for about 5 years in my home. And it was in the midst of that, when I was 15, in a very dark place, that I had my first real personal encounter with Jesus. And it was really it was entirely unsolicited and totally surprising. Even though I've been praying the rosary for 3 years and faith was opening up new horizons in my mind and heart. My idea of God was that he created the world, but sort of was somehow beyond the clouds, hadn't really entered into my life and didn't seem personally real. But at this moment, when I was in this very dark place as a 15-year-old, I didn't talk to anyone, even my best friend, about my experience of my home life or anything like that. And it was just in this moment that I didn't have a vision or didn't hear oral words or anything, but in my heart, I knew I was in the presence of Jesus. And he was saying, I know what it's like for everything to fall down. I know what it's like to feel totally alone, to be abandoned, for there to be total darkness, because I was like that when I was on the cross. But I want you to believe that it doesn't finish there, that that's not the end of the story, that there is hope, there is resurrection. And I clung to that belief, and I did accept that. And things, it wasn't like 5 minutes later, everything was different. It was just gradually I realized that something had shifted inside of me and something new was opened up. And I knew from this moment that Jesus was in my life, that he knew everything that was going on, that he could be trusted. So that was really the first key encounter that I tangibly was aware of, the presence of God like that.
And you went, did you have a successful AFL career? You went into your AFL career with that faith.
I did. So the following year I was recruited by Hawthorn when I was in year 11 to come to Melbourne. At that stage there was no AFL team in Brisbane. It was still being talked of. And so when I arrived in Melbourne after having finished my year 12 in Brisbane, where I grew up, I was playing with the reigning premiers, and I felt like a fraud, to be honest, arriving as this 17-year-old skinny kid from Brisbane. I wasn't from any of the AFL states like WA or South Australia, whatever. And I was so skinny, I couldn't do one chin up, and I was embarrassed. My training level fitness was nowhere near and I just thought like I was vomiting at training, and it was terrible. And I thought, they're going to give me the flick. But after the first season, I got another year, contract. They obviously knew that it's going to take time to build up, and then the following season, I played my first game, kicked 5 goals in my first game, round 5, so I was a bit stronger, a bit fitter, and a little bit more competitive, and so one thing led to the other.
Wow. How many years did you play?
I played 12 years for
12
Hawthorn,
years.
and played in the 91 Premiership.
Now, I'm not going to go into more detail about your conversion of footy because there's a reason for that. We're going to leave that to our friends at Against the Grain.
Fair enough.
And I hope that people will tune in, because there'll be a second interview with Father Ben Saliba, Against the Grain, where Steve's going to dive in more about that footy career. So this podcast is not about that. I just wanted to let people know that's a bit of your background. We're going to be talking about this.
Okay.
This is not your first book; it's your second book. Is that
Third,
right?
actually.
Third.
Yeah.
What are the other two?
The first one was a journal that I wrote during the World Youth Day 2008, because I was one of the directors of that.
Nice.
And so it was a really World Youth Day has been a big part of my life. So just last year I took my 7th group to World Youth Day.
Wow.
Bit of a junkie. And I was one of the directors of Sydney World Youth Day, director of evangelisation and catechesis. So I had a major role in that. And so during that time, I actually wrote a 40-day journal leading up to and including the days of the World Youth Day. So it's a kind of snapshot of the events, with also doorways into previous and other World Youth Days. So it's largely reflections, anecdotes, observations, plus, a lot of, on the homilies and things that were happening with the
Can that be used sort of for World Youth Days in the future?
It was pitched particularly for leaders of the next World Youth Day, which was, well, when I say pitched, it was intended, but it's really, it's also, it's hard to categorize, because it's a little bit like this book, with lots of anecdotes about family life and encounters on the street and, official things, but all interwoven. So it's quite integrated. So that was the first book, a little bit unwieldy probably. And then the second was a leadership book I wrote in 2019 called Make Your Mark.
Make Your Mark, Fantastic. We actually have that on our website, Make Your Mark.
Yeah, thanks.
So I invite people to check that out. This one here, we're very excited to be launching this, published with Perusia, and we're excited that we can make this available around the world. So anyone, this is exciting at the time of this podcast. If you're watching this now or listening to it, the links will be in the description, but this is available now worldwide. And very, very impressive. It's not a huge book, but you have quite a few chapters. So they're not So it's a fast-paced book. You can get through this very easily and comfortably. You cover a huge amount of topics, but all within, I guess, again, for men to stand up. Freedom is where you begin. Could you tell us, I guess, what inspired this book firstly?
Okay.
And what sort of how long did it take to get to this?
Well, in my work, I have my own business. So for the last 7 years, I've got Altum Leadership Group, which is the name of my business. So it's effectively a faith leadership business, consulting, speaking, coaching, mentoring, writing, for most like people in ministry and education,
Yes,
who have leadership roles. The name Altum, of course, is from like Duc in Altum, when John Paul II, we lived in Rome when John Paul II published the pastoral document for the third millennium with, Duc in Altum was everywhere. And, I was very inspired by his witness and, testimony, and this idea of going into the deep waters with the evangelization mission to sort of really go out into the third millennium. And so the word Altum means both high and deep in Latin.
Oh, okay.
So I love this juxtaposition. So we all want to reach to the heights and go to the, be the best we can be in whatever version of ourselves we are. But the irony is, in order to do that, we have to go down to the depths. It's the whole paradox of the cross. We go down in order to come up.
Yes.
We lower ourselves and the Lord lifts us up, so that's the idea of the juxtaposition is kind of built into the title, the tiny book for giant men.
Yes.
So it's about being small like Saint Therese, but in fact, the Lord makes us big. It's about humility and magnanimity, together.
I love that.
So in a lot of my speaking, including often to groups of men, which I do a fair bit of, I've done that over a number of years. In fact, I was reflecting at the beach a couple of weeks ago with some of my kids. There's a place where I gave my first public talk at a pub. It was a men's breakfast in Mentone, where we were just near where we were at the beach. And I said, that's where I did my first talk about 30 odd years ago. And so there's been many, many talks over the years, including to men's groups, all sorts of different men's groups. And so it's been in my heart for probably 10 years to actually write a book for men. Okay. And I knew that if I really wanted to write what God wanted me to write, I wasn't going to force it. I was just going to let him lead me and guide me. And so it was kind of resonating for a long, long time. And about 4 or 5 years ago, I started to think, I want to write this. And it was during COVID that I thought, I think it's time. There was a lot more, there wasn't as much driving around and all that. In Melbourne, we had 6 lockdowns. We're still recovering. Seriously, it was
world renowned. Everyone around the world was talking about that.
And I thought to myself, well, if I'm going to write something for men, how do I write something that's going to be absolutely, really what I want to write? Not for a market or anything like that. I didn't really want to worry about that. I thought if what I really wrote was in my heart, that was what the Lord wanted me to give to men, then it would be totally authentic. And I wasn't sure how to really go about that. And then it sort of dawned on me, well, what I would write for my sons would be what would be totally true. In other words, I thought, well, if I'm going to write for men without sort of being abstract, with being really practical, being really kind of direct, very clear, fresh, from experience, but also looking at scripture, lives of the saints, whatever, just in just on themes, then I would do it that way. So I did. I thought, okay, so I bought myself a journal, just paper blanks journal, quite a small one. I thought I'm going to write it within the pages of this, handwrite it. Okay. And I'm not going to map it out. I'm not really a great mapper outer of things. Okay. I'm just going to make it be born out of prayer. So a long-time personal prayer each morning. And then, so I thought, okay, the first thing I want to write about is freedom. So, and then I started writing it, handwriting it, and then one thing led to the other. I finished it within the book and then typed it out and so forth. So it moved on from there. That was how it started.
Okay, beautiful. So what's the style? If we can help people, I guess, what can they expect? So you cover quite a bit. This is you giving advice to your boys?
It's fatherly advice to my sons, how to be a man in this world. Basically, that's it.
Wow. And I guess 10 years, hasn't the world changed in even 10 years? So when you started with the concept and then 10 years, has it impacted the way you would give advice, or is it the same advice?
Yeah, not really. I mean, it's true. Things have changed and things will continue to change. And technically there's a lot of things that advance, but human nature is the same.
Yeah, very good.
It's the same as the beginning. It's the same as it will be down the, and also, obviously there are factors and to be aware of, and sometimes I allude to, things like that. But basically, if you think of it's like the gospel. It's not out of date, is it?
No, that's right.
Like it's always a living word and there's a living reality. So, the themes each day was a different theme. So, like for example, first theme is freedom.
Yeah.
Then it goes into purpose and looks at silence and looks at courage and looks at brotherhood and looks at fatherhood and looks at self-control and it's essentially a kind of guide to live a virtuous, holy life as a man. Very concrete, practical realities, depending on your own vocation and circumstances.
Beautiful. Would any man read this? Would this be for single men, married men, engaged men, religious men, those in religious orders?
Already, even though this is now really the beginning of the proper launch of it, I haven't really done it much because of the end of last year, even though there's a few, I've got young men reading it, like 18-year-old, like even my sons. Jerome actually got me to read a few chapters of it while we were driving yesterday.
Oh, wow.
When he was driving. And then there are older men, like in their 60s, most of the contents are things that we're all dealing with on a daily basis, whatever our relationships are, dealing with work, dealing with challenges, pressures, things you referred earlier to. Questions like pornography, struggles that we all have to deal with, our own frailty. Do we have what it takes to get up in the morning and actually live this day effectively? These are the real challenges of men. I think every day, like, do you have what? This is one of the things John Paul II said. He said every man needs to know that he has what it takes, and every woman needs to know she's beautiful. This is his theology of the body. So my next book is actually the tiny book for beautiful women that I'm going to write to my 3 daughters and my 2 granddaughters. And so,
oh wow, that's exciting.
It is. It's kind of ruminating as well, but not now. But it's based on these kind of intuitions of John Paul II, really.
Beautiful. I noticed. Yeah, he's there right at the beginning as a forward. He wrote. This is the year of Saint Joseph, where you've got here.
Well, I wrote. So I wrote the book in 2020, and then I wrote a forward on the feast of St. John Paul II, so 22nd of October, in the year of St. Joseph, which was 2021. Then I sat with it. It didn't feel really ready yet.
Okay.
And I didn't do anything about it. And I thought, I'm not going to force it. No. It's the Lord's project when in his time, And then in 2023, which was last year, I got to the point I thought, it's ready to be published. I think it's ready. And actually asked different people, and I thought maybe I'll try and get it published through Ignatius Press.
Oh yes, yes.
That was my first thought. It was actually Michael.
They are
O'Brien,
the largest Catholic publisher in the world.
Who recommended me contact them? So I did, and I waited 3 or 4 months before I wrote back and said, "What do you guys think of the manuscript?" "Oh, sorry, we haven't read it yet." No, that's not it. So I sort of sat on it. The other thing is, in the meantime, one of my daughters had a issue in her marriage, so that sort of made me feel just to put on hold. But eventually, this is where you come in, Charbel. I really was feeling like it's really ready to. I feel now it's time to move on it. And in our community, we have a small household praying group once a week, and I took it to them. I said, "Guys, can you please pray for this book? I feel like the Lord wants to move it now." And so they prayed over me and prayed for it. And the next day, I had this thought, I've got to dedicate it to the Cardinal, who had only died, at the end of the previous year. In fact, my 2 sons, Jerome and Ambrose, and I, when we were in Rome, we saw him and had a long lunch with him for about 4 hours, like 2 months before he died. He'd been a great friend for a long time, and I'd worked with him, and a great mentor and father figure. So I wrote this. I punched out a 3-page dedication, and I thought, now it's ready. And within a couple of days, I met you at lunch with Peter August. Do you remember we were trying to catch up and we couldn't. And then Peter brought you along anyway. And I was telling you the story and you said, "I'll publish it." And then one thing led to the other. And then people like Paul Morrissey and Rob Falzon and Deacon Harold Burke-Sitters and Dan Donaldson all were writing very quickly. It was very easy. It was like very open, the door open. So it felt like it's really on the way now. So
who mentioned to me was a friend, David Howick as well.
David,
So it was like, it's interesting. These things come in threes, sort of. So I was hearing it through different people, and it's like it's meant to be.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if there was ever an image of manhood that, the Cardinal Pell.
Yeah. Can we talk about him? It is dedicated to him. So, Cardinal Pell. I mean, what a giant man himself.
Yeah.
And the legacy he's left, and so misunderstood in the media. more than any person. I mean, probably there's other characters out there that probably misinterpreted, but Cardinal Pell's always been labeled all sorts of things,
know.
and it's the complete opposite if you know
It's
him.
unbelievable.
And you've known him for, I mean, how many years would it be?
I met him in 1990, so
Wow.
that was whatever that is, 30 odd years. And
As long as you're married, a bit longer.
yeah, well, he celebrated our wedding.
Oh wow!
And he came with Annie to watch the grand final. He was a great lover of footy, and he was already close at that time. You know, I've had many dinners with him, worked with him, and had a very close proximity working under him. Like he was my boss, you know, in youth ministry in Melbourne, university chaplaincy in Sydney, World Youth Day, and so many, you know, so many contacts. And it's true, he's a very warm man, very funny, often cheeky, but extremely thoughtful, loving, interested, obviously erudite. You know, one of the things I say in this is there are many things said about the Cardinal, you know, the great leader, the visionary, the manager, you know, the wrongly accused, and there's a whole long list. I said, but one of the things actually I haven't found since he had died that was said so much about him, but how masculine he was. You know, how manly he was. And I don't mean this in a, you know, there's this whole thing of toxic masculinity or whatever. Often you know, quite false.
That's right.
But anyway, but there is a thing called toxic masculinity, you know, let's say. But I think often it's attributed wrongly, the word. But anyway, he was certainly a very gentle man. It takes a powerful man to be a gentleman. You know what I mean? It's a bit like Aslan, you know. You know, he's something to be wary of, but he can be, you know, I forget the phrase, but anyway. But the Cardinal was like that. He was a true gentleman. He had enormous capability, enormous passion, enormous power, but very loving, very thoughtful. I absolutely love him as a father and as a leader and as a friend. You know, someone very, very much missed by many of us and by many, many people. But someone who it just resonated so deeply when I had this thought after being prayed for to dedicate the book to him, which I did on the feast of the martyrdom of John the Baptist, which I thought was fitting. Just happened to land on that time. So anyway, so it's dedicated to him, and so I'm asking him to pray for it, that it will go where God wants. You know?
He himself, he did play AFL growing up, but he never made. Did he get selected?
He was recruited by Richmond, which is his team. When he was in Melbourne, he became a Sydney person and they're very for Sydney. But that was always a bit fake. Not fake, but it was genuine. But I think it was a bit, you know, to make the effort. But certainly he was invited to come to Richmond, but he then entered the seminary, so he never did that. Wow. But he was a top level footballer.
Wow, there you go. One of the things I remember him when he just arrived in Sydney. So I guess my history is 2001. So 23 years now, 22. But what he did in Sydney, and it was very evident, even very early on, there was all these appointments that were coming through, and a lot of people from Melbourne were coming over to Sydney. What's going on? And they're setting up and the seminary. Well, I was in the seminary in 03. That's where we met, and just noticing, he's obviously done this before. He's tested this. He's got people he trusts, and praise God, he followed through. He was like a chess man putting the pieces together, and he knew long term where this was going. And it hit me like a ton of bricks last year. After, you know, in memory of his legacy, just last year, the fruits of what he did in Sydney alone. I'm not even going to, I mean, what he did in Melbourne is amazing, but in Sydney, we're only getting it at the beginning of the next generations benefiting from what he's done over the last 20 years, 30 years. And we're seeing it. And I think we're seeing it. What has he done? We're talking about now ordinations of so many priests, young priests, faithful priests, loyal priests, including the one that's going to interview next. That I think it all started because Cardinal Pell had a long-term vision, and he put things in place to outlast him. And now the next generation is going to benefit. And I think we're in good hands. Sydney, Melbourne, and even the wider church. So the universal church also benefits in a big way because of his role in the Vatican. But then even after he dies, his name is still being used, and I think he's doing a lot from heaven, I think.
Oh, I mean, and the testimony, even if you just look at the testimony of his time in prison,
Yes,
which of course
alone.
put a spotlight on him,
Yeah.
and gives his witness more power, really more
Yeah.
authority, as a, like St. Paul in prison or whoever, and then of course he's got the prison diaries, so that all of that is still part of the legacy that people are unpacking,
Yes.
But also there's a great benefit of other wonderful bishops like Archbishop Fisher who continue, and bring their own strengths and gifts as well, and he's building on what was already put in place, and I think that's important because you can just let things stop and they can wind down, and that's happened in places as well.
Yeah. Well, the topic. So can we touch on just what I wanted to do here? That you got 17 topics. I'd love to just sort of tap on. Well, there's 19. I'd like to touch on a few of them, and then maybe we can unpack it, give people a bit of a taste what to expect in the book.
Yeah.
And now you start with freedom.
Yeah.
Just very quickly, let's start there. What is freedom? And I guess what's true freedom versus, I guess, what the world tells us what freedom is.
I'll just say one thing about that, and that is when God gives us the commandments, he says, I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of slavery. So in other words, I give you freedom.
Yes.
And if you follow my commandments, you'll be free.
Wow.
So it's about listening to God's word. And of course, that was the fall in the garden, was to disobey and to not trust. And so it became unfree, like slavery, and then woundedness and disintegration and death. Of course, Jesus does the opposite. He brings healing and life and resurrection. But freedom is his goal for us. That's how, to be authentically human requires that we be free.
Yeah.
And so that's what I say. Look, set your goal to be free, fully free. Of course, it's based on the truth. And Jesus said, I've come that you may have life, and also it's the truth will set you free. So you need to be in the truth. Without truth, you won't be free.
Yeah, wow, powerful. It is one of the things we always forget. I mean, right in the beginning, we had freedom, full freedom, Adam and Eve in the garden and all of that. It doesn't seem like a God that had all this long list of rules. He only had one rule, be fruitful and multiply, but then don't eat the fruit of this tree. And then pretty much that's it. Everything else goes. Go play, go do whatever, discover.
Says, don't eat from the tree, but do anything else.
Yeah.
There's plenty of other trees in this beautiful garden.
So, God gets accused of being this tyrant in the Old Testament that...
Well, that's part of the deception.
Yeah, the true freedom. And it was our abuse of that freedom that got us into this position.
So just say in the book, every chapter has usually one or two different anecdotes or stories. It's not just advice or kind of looking at scripture. There's usually some personal story that illustrates it, or that kind of reminds them, or so there are lots of little stories as well.
You've got biblical quotes here as well. So you draw on your personal experience and then some.
My experience is only so limited as a guide.
Okay.
Obviously, the Word of God is much richer, and the lives of the saints and the teaching of the church. Obviously, I might be able to add something with my own experiences, and what I've received, what graces I've received, I try and hand those on, and so I try and tie all that together in each topic.
So good.
Yeah.
Underestimate that topic. We need to be unpacking it further, because today's world is just this idea of you can do whatever you want, you can be free, but so many people with so many addictions, they're not free. No. They're still in slavery, aren't they?
Yeah. Well, there's freedom from and there's freedom for.
Yes.
And the freedom for the gift of self, freedom for service, freedom for healthy relationships requires, that we actually obey certain commands.
Yes.
To actually be unhinged from God is to actually enter into slavery. So and the false notions of freedom are, what does JP2 say? He talks about, I forget the quote, but that freedom is based on being able to not to do what we ought, not to do what we want, but to do what we ought.
Yes.
And that's different.
I remember him saying.
Yeah.
Powerful. You there's this one, being and recreation. Being and recreation. What's that chapter about?
So that chapter is essentially about it's linked to worship,
Okay.
and it's about the importance of co-creation. That
Mm.
we are, we're called to live in the Lord, to abide in God, and before talking about work,
Yes.
I actually leave work for later. What's more important is, the Sabbath, let's say,
Yes.
our worship of God. But linked to that is also our whole sense of recreation, allowing ourselves to enjoy and to recognize that everything we achieve that's fruitful is a co-creation with God. It's not just originating in us, it's being conceived in us. And so creating space of having holidays and there's a whole lot of examples there of games and having time with children and playing together and not rushing and doing a million things. Actually,
Yes.
it's actually drawing from the book by Joseph Pieper. He says Leisure, the Basis of Culture. It's one of the masterpieces of the 20th century.
Wow.
I don't quote
I've got
him,
to read
strictly
that.
speaking.
Yeah.
But he talks, it's really much the concept of the Sabbath and worship. That true worship is to enter into a life with God and trusting that everything comes from Him. And so it's not just about, and of course, even our work has to become a co-creation, which is the idea of John Paul II. He talks about, work as co-creation in his encyclical on that point. This is not an academic work in that sense, but the concept of first giving yourself over to trusting that God is the source of everything. To really live recreation and holidays and joyful engagements and having hobbies, all of that is actually a way in which we honor God, and it's linked to our worship for God.
Wow. So I love that. Yeah, normally would end on rest, but we're starting with rest and
Yeah.
recreation. We team to what can we do to work for the Lord? But hang on, even in our recreation, it's not that you don't switch off from God or you don't switch off from who you are. We just are. We are who we are, authentically who we are, all the time, working or at rest and recreation. So it's
And if we understand rest to be in order to get us back to work, it's not in order.
Yeah.
Sabbath is first,
Yeah.
And so even if you look at the order of the commandments, if we can come back to them, God is first, the Sabbath, and then, the honoring your parents, and then the tasks.
Yes.
So it's living in God, kind of, and everything flows out of that, rather than the other way.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
Wow. Look, we have to touch on courage, because I mean, the first thing, if you think about being a real man, is a man of courage. What angle do you take here? I mean, what can we expect in this chapter? It's chapter 7, the day of rest, but courage. What's that about?
Yeah, I do allude to the fact that, and it's well known, that courage in some ways is the quintessential masculine, which is not to say women aren't courageous. They can be very much courageous. And there are different kinds of courage. You've got moral courage. We have to do something in the face of pressure or difficulties, and there are examples of that. But you've also got, physical courage, which we talk about, with people who are in emergency situations, or military people, or, sports people, or whatever.
Yes.
And then there's spiritual courage, having the courage to trust and take a step in a new direction where you don't really, like Abraham, to give you a biblical example, but he believed. So courage and faith are quite linked, and hope, but he believed that God was calling him somewhere, and he had no idea really how it would work out. It's like any kind of, it's like someone entering the seminary or getting married, or, starting a new thing, leaving work that you aren't satisfied with, and finding a new, embarking on a new project. So courage has many dimensions. Underneath it all is somehow trust. Trust that you will be cared for irrespective,
you have a chapter on that too later on.
Yeah, trust.
16.
It's funny because that's really about money.
Okay.
I actually thought I'm not going to write a chapter called money, because I didn't really want it to be the topic. It's not the end.
Interesting.
Money is not the end. So even though I set out to write about money, I thought I actually want to write about trust here. And so in that I talk about, I give many examples of, seek first the kingdom,
Yes.
and everything else will be given to you. Which of course
Powerful.
doesn't mean to be irresponsible, doesn't mean to not have technical knowledge, doesn't mean not to, do everything you can within your own strengths and abilities. Of course, it does include all of those sort of things. But ultimately, God created the whole universe. There's 50
Yes.
billion zillion stars.
Yes.
When Jesus multiplied the water and wine, it was abundant.
Mhm.
They didn't need anything like that. When Joseph was told to go to Egypt, I mean, how was he going to do that? Well, God had already given him a whole pile of gold from the king. So, he didn't plan it. You know what I mean?
Yes,
Like there's always a way. God will always lead us. And so I think, was Jesus being impractical when he gave that advice? Seek first the kingdom and everything else, food, clothing, all the things that we know we need and God knows
Yes.
we need. He says, no, he actually knows we need those things. He knows we've got to deal with those things. But if we put him first, and really first, he'll take care of things.
Wow, that is
and
awesome.
I think my experience is that that's really true.
Yeah,
Even if
powerful.
there are times, like the first 2 years of my business, I remember this is a little story I share there, but I remember one time I was really scraping like almost on nothing and it was not quite going where I thought. And one day I went to go and buy a coffee and I was with my son Jerome and my card went bong bong,
Oh.
and then I worked it. I got rejected to buy $4.50 coffee, and I actually checked it out. I had $1.91 in the bank total.
Wow.
My actual,
Wow.
my whole any account or whatever.
Wow.
$1.91. And Jerome said to me, "Dad, your business is not really going very well, is it?" And I thought, no, but that was 5 years ago.
Wow.
And so things moved after that. But it's not to say I had lots of difficult moments, but if God is leading you, he'll open the doors somehow. And obviously, there's a lot of factors linked: having good advice, being willing to listen to people, and getting help, and and so on. But
That's
growing your
important.
capabilities. But at the same time, God is always there. So,
Yeah.
so trusting in that.
Trust in that, even if it's just $1.91, trust.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's happened a couple of times in our family as well over the years. At my wife at the grocery store, but we're still here, and we can provide. That's the point. That's great. There is one here, servant, and then I want to do the one straight after that too. Servant.
Okay.
What do you mean by that? Servant.
I keep referring back to Jesus, don't I?
Yeah, it's great. He's the model of all these things.
He is. I mean, and also, look, for everyone who's a father or a husband or a friend, we're called to be servants of other people. And, as John Paul II has said, the true, an authentic discovery of ourself is in the gift of ourself.
Yes.
So it's only really when we put ourselves at the service of the other person, and especially in marriage, this is mutual self-gift. It's 100-100. It's not 50-50, and so obviously the nature of the way a husband loves his wife is different than the way a wife loves her husband. And there are certain biblical demands that are made on the husbands, and they're tough, actually pretty tough, and both ways. But, and if Jesus is the image of a husband, he gives himself, totally sacrifices himself for his wife and serves her. And if you are not willing to serve your wife, you should not marry.
Oh, there it is.
And if you're not willing to serve the people that you might be a priest for, or a deacon or a bishop for, you're not going to be a good priest. You've got to be, and if you're not willing to really serve your friend, because sometimes friends are great fun to be with, but sometimes they really need you. And you need to sort of, like my daughter just the last 2 days has spent probably 7 or 8 hours talking to 2 friends who've recently broken up, relationships. Wow. And she's starting a new job. She started a new job today. I think.
Oh, wow.
So this is a real servant of a friend.
Yeah.
And so I think, the greatest among you must be a servant.
Yeah.
So if you want to be a giant man, you have to be a servant, like
That's
Jesus,
cool.
So
Yes.
it's basically that. Obviously there's unhealthy ways of thinking about that you have to caution against. Some people aren't free the way that they do things. They can be overly obliged or overly responsible. You have to work out all of those, deal with all of those sort of things. But essentially, the gift of self requires sacrifice. It means making an effort. It means putting yourself out. And I guess I'm thinking in particular for a husband not willing to do that, he's going to have an unhappy. His wife is going to be unhappy, and he's going to be unhappy because if his wife's unhappy, he can't be happy. Yeah, ultimately. So yeah, there's a whole lot. I mean, obviously, we have to learn to grow in ways of doing. I mean, I have a little thing that I have a journal that I keep, and I try to remind myself because I'm forgetful and I'm not very good at it and all that, but to cherish Annie every day and to serve her. I specify those two things. How have I done that today when I'm praying? How have I done that today? I think some days I haven't done that. And she's my wife and she's in my house. She's in my house, So we can get distracted even if it's our intention.
Yes.
So yeah, for me, I constantly need to remind myself, and it's my desire. And as a married man, that's at the heart of my vocation. So if I'm not doing that, it doesn't matter what else I'm doing. I'm not living my call.
So true. I mean, especially as a speaker and speaking on leadership as well, this would be also critical.
It is,
to be a good leader. I mean, servant leadership is
exactly the same.
Yeah. Wow.
The first among you will be the last.
Wow. There's so many topics. I mean, this could be a course. I mean, this could be a course.
I've thought about that. Thinking about that.
Maybe keep that in the back of your mind.
Okay.
But chapter 15, self-mastery. I think it's an important one. Please talk about this because I think we're in a time where we really are lacking in this space. I mean, all of these are relevant, but that one really stood out to me. I think I'd like our viewers to learn more about what you mean there.
This is one of the longer chapters. I mean, most of them are 3 or 4 pages. There's maybe some that are 5 or 6 or 7. And it's really, this is linked to the question of sex drive. Mm-hmm. So this is self-mastery is linked to that whole question of our drive to love, our drive to have communion.
Yes.
Which is a gift from God. It's a good thing. God created men with a strong sex drive. I think it's good for us to keep that in mind. It's actually a gift. The Lord had it. Jesus had it. All the apostles had it. And the question is, how do we live with that in a good way? And what is the Lord calling us to do in terms of that? So there's a question there. One of the things I refer to, and I don't know if I can talk about it here, but the word mastery popped up when I was doing my studies of John Paul II Institute for Marriage and Family. And I came upon the book of Tobit.
Oh, yeah.
So, in the book of Tobit, Tobias is the son of Tobit, and he's accompanied by the angel Raphael, whom Tobias doesn't know is an angel, to go and fix up the story collect some money, basically, for his dad. And also, along the way, Raphael is matchmaking him with the woman Sarah, who in fact has had 7 other husbands, right? Each of whom has been killed by a demon, the demon of lust, on the wedding night.
Wow.
So the poor girl, her self-esteem she goes to make love with her husband and he dies. It cannot be very good for her. So this is really also a story about restoration of women, the way they're looked at, which is very much a question linked to men's sexuality because we're very much visual, in a way that women aren't. Women are how they are perceived. That's why they're so conscious of dressing and all that. Anyway, so Sarah's story is very much a suffering story of a woman who's unhappy, not able to be married. And Tobias comes along, and as he's walking along the river with Raphael, he puts his feet in the river, and his giant fish goes to swallow his foot, right? And Raphael, in the Vulgate version, it says master the fish. This is the word coming out in the chapter. He says, master the fish. You'd sort of say, well, get rid of the fish, flick it off. But no, so it's often we think sexual self-mastery is avoidance, flick it off. In fact, it's not that. It's about mastering the struggle, okay? And in the story of the struggle, Raphael basically says to Tobias, he has to capture the fish. Mm-hmm. And that fish then has the qualities within it that will not only, when the heart of the fish is burnt on the wedding night, will dispel the demon of lust, but also the gall will actually heal his dad, Tobit, in his eyes. So there's a whole looking thing here, right?
Yes.
Because he'd been blinded because he had bird poo in them, right? Which is what eventually happens. Okay, but there's this beautiful prayer in the story. So I'm very truncating the story.
Yes.
But there's a beautiful prayer in the story of Tobias, and it's often used in weddings, where he says, "I do not take my sister, my bride, out of lustful motives, but out of singleness of heart or purity of heart." So there's very much the story, I believe, in my reading, and I actually haven't read this much, but in my reading, it does seem to be a story that's about this self-mastery, and we can see. So, I mean, obviously, the lives of the saints and the doctors of the church refer to the fish as a Christ figure, which of course it is, but it's also, I think, in a specific way, Christ in the sexual drive, sanctifying, restoring. So the woman that they end up consummating, everything goes well, they're happily married. The angel.
Yes.
It's financially beneficial, which is not necessarily the case always, but in this case it is, because it brings a lot of riches. The dad is healed and there's a lot of restoration. He's been very good with corporal works of mercy, burying the dead and so on. So this self-mastery is about allowing the Lord to integrate our sexuality, our whole personality, which I think the mystery of the Assumption is for. I often pray this at the Assumption because Mary went into heaven, body and soul.
Yes.
So she had the integration of her whole humanity. She was entirely without sin, right? And we can ask Mary to help us in that, to integrate our passions, our desires, our emotion, our bodies, our mind, into this oneness, so that we can be not only experiencing this self-mastery, but of course, this then becomes a source of power for the Lord in us and through us for others.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
Wow.
So that's that's a story. Yeah. So it's a genius book.
Yes.
I love it. Yeah.
It's funny. My phone was just ringing there, and my son Raphael was ringing.
Oh,
as
really?
you were
Oh, there we
talking about
go.
it. I was like, oh, what are the chances?
Accompanied by
the healer. Couple more, and then I'd like to just get your advice here. You talk about this. I want to go on all of them. They're all powerful. Oh boy, forgiveness is there. Let's talk about forgiveness.
Well, you have Christopher West out here just recently, right?
Yes.
And he talked about the 4 F's of a sacramental marriage.
Yes.
Free, faithful, fruitful, forever.
Yes.
The 5th F, I think, is forgiveness.
Yeah.
Because if whenever there's any kind of accumulation of offences, often they're little things. It's like a dam. It's built up with lots of little sticks. It's usually not one major thing that causes an obstacle in a relationship. Sometimes it is, but mostly it's lots of little things, of things you don't say, things you should say, things you don't do, whatever, or things that you do, and they accumulate, and we just feel this distance. It's hard to sort of think, I don't feel as close to that person. That we all know that feeling. Well, if we're on, and this is what Annie and I have always tried to do, and I've been perhaps very sensitive to it because of my mum and dad's conflict, and they were separated after that whole period, and there was a lot of need for forgiveness, and I saw that you got to deal with it as it happens.
Yes.
Otherwise, mountains build up. And so, if you have the don't let the sun go down on your anger, not only in marriages but in any relationship, mother and son, colleagues or whatever, and just to be humble and go, look, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said that like that, was wrong. Not to justify, not to excuse, and to say, I forgive you, rather than make them feel like they shouldn't have said whatever. So if you're dealing with things as they come, then like if you use, for example, sacramental marriage as an example, the river that I use, the dam, that's an image of the sacramental grace flowing, this, the Lord's presence, the Holy Spirit working. But if, that can be blocked, and you've got a dam, it's still there, but we become the obstacle. The Lord's always with us, but and so forgiveness, and there have been examples, and I often tell the story, Annie tells a story of one time where she had a whole pile up of things that she needed to forgive me for, and at that time I was really worried about our marriage, but in one night, it went several hours of conversation, and I felt like Rocky Balboa. She was kind of hammering me with all these things. So I'm so sorry, and she forgive me, and then all of a sudden they were gone. It was like the whole dam had just disappeared, and then intimacy returned, and like sometimes, of course, there are sometimes serious obstacles that can be in the way, and I know that that's the case, and occasionally it's better, especially if there's physical or psychological damage going on, whatever. People need to be better to be outside of, to be apart.
Yes.
But a lot of marriages, a lot of relationships actually are much closer to restoration than we think, just with a little bit of time to talk and listen and forgive, not to sort of try and be right or score points, but just to, like Annie and I sometimes try and hold hands when we're arguing.
Okay.
It just changes the whole dynamic.
You don't squeeze too hard
No,
sometimes.
because I mean, it's a reminder, tangible reminder that our unity is really the key goal here.
Yes.
Our unity is the goal. So it's not about me trying to, we're often so proud, let's be honest, proud and arrogant and self-important. I mean, I know I am. And I have been over the years very much. It's like, oh, gee, it's really not that important. Like what's more important is, so let me swallow my pride and let me say, I'm sorry for that. So I think, and of course, Jesus came in order to forgive us for our sins.
Yes.
That's the whole reason he came.
Amazing.
We hear this Lent, repent, turn around and, believe. I'm here for that, So
isn't that powerful?
Yeah.
I can't stop thinking, but his first public words are repent, for the kingdom of heaven's hand. And his first words on the cross, Father, forgive, for they do not know what they do. It's like we can't expect to be forgiven if we're not first sorry, and but also we're not willing to forgive. If we're not willing to forgive, how would we expect forgiveness?
That's it.
So we've got to forgive as well.
Well, that's what the Our Father says.
That's healing, yeah.
Forgive us as we forgive others.
How? We say it daily.
It's a tough word. Tough
is.
words. Sometimes like, oh, how am I going with that particular person?
Wow.
So, yeah.
All right. I could do let's finish with greatness. Greatness.
Yeah.
And I mean, sort of greatness. You got this great mountain here on the cover, giant men.
Jerome designed the cover.
Love it. He did a great job.
He did, didn't he?
Great job. Greatness. What can we expect? It's the last chapter in the book.
Okay.
Chapter 19.
Well, Mary boasts of being great.
Yes.
Because the Lord did it. My soul magnifies the Lord. And he who, is mighty has done great things for me. So and she did that as an act of the ultimate humility. So this is, again, it's the high and deep, humility and greatness. I think it's Alexandra Havard, refers to the power of magnanimity, the virtue of magnanimity, recognizing that we're called to be saints, each one of us.
Wow.
I mean, in our own way, you different from me and me different from Anthony. But nonetheless, we are. And God wants us to be great. And it doesn't mean famous or important or in the world's eyes kind of thing, but it may be very hidden. But humility and greatness actually require each other, as virtues. So that if these what Havard calls the virtues of the heart, because if we have greatness and a sense of greatness without humility, it's just arrogance. Self-important people who, But if we have humility and a kind of recognize that we're called to lower ourselves and be humble, but not a sense of our own magnanimity, our own greatness, our call. Often we're just like putting ourselves down. Oh, I'm a nobody, that type of idea. Well, it's not true. I'm actually a child of God.
Yes.
I've been given divine authority to speak for him in the world because I'm baptized, and it doesn't, and I'm actually, God has created in preparing for me an eternal, let's say, place in eternity, like for all eternity. I will be a son of the King.
Mm-hmm.
I am a son of the King.
Yes.
I'm already halfway, like let's say on the way there, have to keep, but this is a reality. It's truth. So I think, our greatness has got to be always juxtaposed with humility,
Yes.
So in order to be experiencing the risen life, we have to take up our cross and lay down our life for our friends, We have to be humble to the little tiny things, as St. Therese would say. Little things. And every day. We only have one day to worry about. That's today. So what am I going to do today? How am I going to live today? Just the little things with my family. How I'm going to do my work. How I'm going to rest. How I'm going to use my social media. Just little things. And you only have to live one good day. And you have to just do that each day. And then you live a good life, So, and that's greatness, I think. I mean, that's what St. Therese teaches. She's a great saint, but she talked about the tiny thing. Oh, so appealing, isn't it? Because it's hard to do big things, but we can do little things, tiny things, and hence the tiny book. It's just tiny. It's not a big deal. Each chapter is tiny, and the book's tiny, so easy to read, but it's in order to help us men live, and the world needs men. Then the world needs every particular man.
Yes.
to be fully the man he's called to be, depending on God's mercy, of course, because we all fall, but to really take our place. And the world, especially with kind of radical feminism, which is so ingrained now in our culture, it forces men out.
Yeah.
And there's a little, I make a reference to this if I've got a moment to say something about it.
Please.
There's a gospel passage, it's early on in Mark, where there's a man with a withered hand.
Yes.
I think it's chapter 3 or 4. And he in fact is so kind of, let's say, this represents a kind of diminished masculinity. His right hand, which is like your strong hand or whatever, not even if you're left-handed, you know what I mean? It's his right hand, and it's withered. Like somehow he's not fully himself as a man, let's say. And the Pharisees try to trap Jesus, and the man doesn't even say anything. He's not even asking for anything. So he's already a little bit lacking initiative, lacking strength. And Jesus says to him, stand in the middle. It's very interesting. Take your place. Stop pushing yourself to the outside. Stop allowing yourself to be, pushed out. We need to take your place. And like Adam, in the garden, he was the guardian of the garden.
Yes.
And of course,
That's
I love the way
another
Scott
chapter
Hahn in First Comes Love has, I think, the most satisfying explanation of the original sin, because it includes a physical threat on the life of Adam. And he had to actually stand in front of this beast who was threatening, and he wimped it, basically. Not only physical, because there was a whole lot of other things, but it's like a mafia with a gun to your head saying, would you like me to, and speaking softly, like the serpent, but in fact there's threat. And he stepped out of the breach, and then serpent spoke to Eve. Of course, Jesus is the true man who doesn't do that. He steps into the breach, and he doesn't, like Gandalf, you will not pass, you shall not pass. He stands there, and he's willing to go to the cross. He's willing to do whatever needs to be done for his bride, in order to sacrifice himself. And the men of our days are being pushed out and being told, you shouldn't be there. You're a nobody. It's toxic and all that. But the gospel says to us, take your place, stand in the middle. Jesus says, stand in the middle. And I think this is a very, very important time for that to happen. And it doesn't mean just, like, let's say, high-powered, high-octane masculinity. I don't mean that. I mean just in our own unique way, often with a gentle voice, but just courageously to be true, not to be compromising, and not to be afraid to actually even maybe lose our life, possibly, because that's what we're called to. It's actually that's a man's vocation, is to do that.
Powerful. I mean, as you're speaking, at the image of, I just watched this movie. I highly recommend it, by the way. Hacksaw Ridge.
Oh, it's a ripper.
Hacksaw Ridge. I watched it with my 2 teenage boys.
Yes.
And to see what a true man is this man that who wouldn't hold the weapon, and everyone's making fun of him. Yeah. But he stood by his ground. No, I'm standing by my values. I'm standing by why I made a commitment. Yeah. No one's gonna, and even missed his wedding day. He missed out on all sorts of things. But then who has the last laugh? In the very end, all these lives lost, but he saves one by one on the ridge, Hacksaw Ridge, and he just says, Lord, just give me one more. Just give me one more. And how many? 70? Was that 81 or 70? Something huge in the high 70 bodies saved. They all thank him for it. But he didn't have a weapon. No. Yet he was one of the most courageous men in the whole team there. It's just phenomenal.
The weapon was his faith.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. And what a lesson for us. You don't have to be all on the outside, macho. The true strength it's your inner beliefs, and you're going to stick by them. Yeah. And have it anchored in God. It's just powerful. Yeah. Powerful story. Yeah. You have. I have to ask you before we wrap up. You have a powerful story of when you stood up once, and I want to. There might be a few examples, but there's one that really spoke to me about the famous story on the bus as an AFL player, and they played some inappropriate porn, was it? And you were at the back of the bus as an AFL player, and you were uncomfortable, but you you made a manly decision to do something very courageous, I thought, and it had an impact. Could you please share that story? Because I have to.
Have we got time? Because it's about 5 minutes.
Yeah, please. I think
well,
we got about 5 minutes.
Can I do it?
Yeah, we got it. We can
I'll
fit
try
this
and
in. This is powerful.
So this was I was still relatively young. I had played in the Premiership, but I was in my early 20s and playing with Hawthorn. And we went to we're all in a bus. All the players were in a bus, about 50 of us, coaches and so on in cars. And we're heading down to a training camp at Phillip Island, about 2 hours out of Melbourne. And literally, as we were the bus was just chugging off out of the car park, the bus driver turns on an X-rated pornographic film on the television at the front of and there was this, whoa, you can imagine in the bus. And I'm sitting right at the very back of the bus and I'm thinking, oh no, and it's like, was loud and it was, everyone was cheering, or not everyone, but it was like, you could imagine. And and I thought to myself, oh Lord, what am I going to do here? And I thought, I'm not even near the front. If I'm going to do something, I can't even do it quietly or, surreptitiously. And then I thought I didn't want my teammates, it's always difficult in these moments with your teammates and what are they going to think of you if you do something? And there had been times, in the past where I always wanted to be one of the guys, but I also didn't want to compromise and didn't participate in certain things that sometimes happen. So I thought I'll just look out the window, So I'm sort of looking out the window, trying not to look. But of course, the sound effects are still on, and very stimulating sounds. I'm thinking, I just don't need this. I don't need these thoughts. I don't need these. So I said, Lord, you got to help me. And then I stood up. I had no idea what I was going to do. I stood up and I start walking down the length of the bus, And by about halfway down, what it started to emerge was this growing from among my teammates, because they, when you live every day with guys, they get to know what you stand for and what's important. And so it was like this, Stevie, that was my nickname. Stevie's going to do something, And I don't know how I looked. I might have looked confident. I might have looked strong. My knees were shaking, that sort of feeling, and sweat going down the side of my face. My tongue felt down the side of my face. My tongue was dry, and I had no idea what I would do. And I was a long way walking down to the front of the bus. And just as the moment I arrived to the bus driver, I noticed immediately behind him to his left was a player who I knew was 17, a guy named Luke McCabe.
Okay.
And so I leaned to the bus driver's ear and I said, you have a minor on board this bus. What you're doing is illegal. Turn it off. And, in these moments, you sort of think, I thought he was going to turn around saying, F off, mate, or something like that. To my shock, he didn't say a word. He just reached up and turned it off. Often there's opposition, people make life difficult.
Yes.
But that was the easy thing, because then I had to turn around and face my 50 teammates or 45 teammates and walk the length of the back of to the back of the bus. And I was waiting for the proverbial tomatoes to be thrown,
of course.
Comments, insults, whatever. Silence. And I walk all the way back, and it seemed twice as far walking back. And I sat back down, two guys talking to each other, nothing. The bus trip just kept going. And no one said anything the whole bus trip, nor the 3 days of the training camp, not that whole season.
Wow.
In fact, 7 more seasons at Hawthorn, never mentioned. 18 years later was the first time it was ever mentioned to me by any one of my team. I actually thought over the years, I imagined it was a dream, whatever, made it up in my head. But actually, I was at the funeral of our great coach, Alan Jeans, who had been a multiple premiership coach. And I was with 2 of the players, Andy Collins and Darren Pritchard, who both played in several premierships for Hawthorn, great players. And Andy Collins said to me, Stevie, do you remember the time you turned the porno off on the bus? I said, yes, I remember. I was thinking I'm not nuts. I haven't made it up.
It did actually happen.
It did really happen. And he said, well, as you know, I've been coaching in South Australia for the last few years, but he coached West Adelaide. And he said, and I often get to speak all around the state, like to footy teams, to business groups, community groups, schools, whatever, often on leadership topics. And he said, I want you to know something. I always tell that story.
Wow.
I said, are you kidding me? I haven't heard it back. He said, I reckon I've told about 10,000 people that story live. I said, really? He goes, yeah. And he said, I want to tell you, and says a bit about his character, because he's a great guy. He said, I want to tell you that when I say that story, I say, it's the greatest act of leadership I've ever seen.
Wow.
I said, really? He goes, yeah, because you knew it was the right thing to do. but you knew nobody really agreed with you, but you did it anyway.
Yeah.
He said, I was amazed by that. I said, and here am I thinking, they're all thinking I'm an idiot.
Yeah.
They're all thinking, and actually it was a very important lesson for me to hear him saying this to me. It was like, just do what's right always. Don't try and judge what's the right thing to do by the basis of how many people you think know about it or anything like that. Just always do what's right, and it'll have its own power, And so that was for me a big, big lesson, to constantly do what's right and never worry about the audience, or even if no one watches, even if no one knows.
Absolutely.
And so that was a story that.
I'm glad you got to share that. We've got that on camera because it's a powerful story, and hopefully encourages many men to really just stand by your values, and we don't have to bash people on the head, but just stand up for what we believe is true and what Lord wants. And look at the impact you've had. Almost 2 decades later, you finally find out.
Yeah, well, it's funny because I often do tell that story, and I tell the postscript story, and I've had people occasionally say, "Oh, yeah, I have heard that story in South Australia."
Wow.
Or that other teammate said, "Yeah, look, that was." It's interesting, isn't it? Because often we think in our workplaces or in environments where we're as believing men.
Yes.
It's not always easy, is it? Like we think, "Oh, gee, that's awkward. What's everyone going to think?" Whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
If we're just true and we say, "Look, this is what I believe in. It's important for me." I mean, obviously we've got to be careful how we do that, but be amazed. I think we can be amazed that God will give, even if we feel really awkward and really weak, which I did. You don't plan these moments; they happen. They just.
Yes.
And it's just question is how are we going to deal with it?
I think it's a great story of courage, which is different to being fearless. I mean, you're facing your fears and the fear of rejection or fear of being made fun of.
Yeah.
And I'm so surprised no one said anything.
I know. So was I.
That's the impact that it had on them.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Well, we are out of time. You have another podcast after this, and which is quite exciting. I'm looking forward to seeing that one too, because people, I don't know, I didn't mention this at the start of the show, but the surroundings in here are a little bit different to a typical Perusia podcast, because we're in the actual studios of the Against the Grain podcast, and that's where a father and son talk faith and footy, and it's got some great guests, and I highly recommend people to subscribe to that if they haven't yet, and share it among their family and friends. Just really, really good conversation happens. So I'm wishing you all the best there. Be careful, they're going to drill you.
Okay, good.
Ask you
good.
some
I'll get myself
curveballs.
ready.
But yeah, have fun with that, and I hope people really get a lot out of it. It's a great podcast, and we are blessed to sort of collaborate today, in the studio, and hopefully more to come in the future. So very exciting.
Thanks.
Thank you for writing this book.
Pleasure. Just whatever happens to it happens. It's in the hands of the Lord, and
Yeah, absolutely.
I wrote it. That was my duty. I'll do my best to sort of get it out there, and then.
Well, let's hope it reaches 10,000 plus and beyond.
Yep.
This is a very easy read, so that's what makes it so attractive for anyone to read, all ages. Yeah, would you say sort of a minimum
I would say
age?
teenage. You're probably 15 up.
15 up, and all men. So available right now, perusiamedia.com. It is on Amazon. It is on all the platforms, available now across the world. So please check it out. The Tiny Book for Giant Men. Steve Lawrence, thank you very much. Yeah, God bless you. That's another Perusia podcast. I'm Charbel. I hope you got a lot out of that. Please subscribe to this channel as well, Perusia Media. We've got our website, perusiamedia.com, and subscribe to the podcast, the Narrowgate blogs, all the YouTube videos. Share them among your family and friends. And if you can consider supporting this work, we do have a donation button. And anyone who can consider doing that, a one-off or even an ongoing, that will help us really get not only resources out, but free content out as well around the world. So thanks again for everyone for your support. That's another podcast. Till next time, God bless.